Myst, Might, Mayhem. By Han Jung-Wioya. Chapter 236. Primordial True Chi. Part 1. It was a night with an unusually white and bright moon. Zhu Wenhyang, who was moving from the individual training room of the embroidered uniform guard training grounds to the dormitory, stopped his steps near the rear gate of the dormitory. What's going on? Two embroidered uniform guard warriors were standing guard under the torchlight at each gate. Since it was close to the morning, it was common for some of them to doze off occasionally, but it was strange that both of them had their heads lowered. Zhu Wenhyang approached them closely and examined them. Swish! He lightly touched them. However, they remained motionless with their heads lowered. At this, Zhu Wenhyang placed his fingers on the pulses on their necks, acupuncture point sealing. Acupuncture point sealing was a technique that could put the opponent to sleep or immobilize them by pressing specific acupoints on the human body, and these guards had been subjected to it. To do such a thing here. Although the martial arts of the embroidered uniform guard warriors weren't that strong, who could have been so bold to do this in the embroidered uniform guard's territory? Zhu Wenhyang slowly drew upon his energy with vigilance. Something didn't feel right. Snap. At that moment, the sound of fingers snapping came from the corner of the wall. Turning his head, he saw the figures of two individuals in the darkness where the torchlight didn't reach. Focusing his energy to enhance his eyesight, their outlines became visible. Mok Jiangan? It was none other than Mok Jiangan, the late-stage disciple of the Heaven and Earth Society. But who was the one kneeling in front of him? The face was covered with something like a headscarf, so it was impossible to see who it was. However, the appearance of being subdued was utterly unsightly. What's going on? Already, his vigilance towards Mok Jiangan had heightened due to the incident during the day, and now he was perplexed about how to interpret this situation. At that moment, Mok Jiangan gestured to Zhu Wenhyang, as if telling him to come closer. He's bold enough to seal the acupoints of embroidered uniform guard warriors in the embroidered uniform guard's territory. No matter what, he'll try to make contact in some way if I avoid him. Although he didn't know what purpose that fellow had, it seemed like a situation he couldn't avoid. After all, they were staying in the same dormitory. Zhu Wenhyang slowly moved his steps towards that place. As the distance narrowed, Mok Jiangan smiled affably and said, "Finally, we have an opportunity to have a quiet conversation." An opportunity for conversation? So, had he been waiting for him all this time? Although he responded calmly and nonchalantly, Zhu Wenhyang's vigilance heightened. How bold of you! Not only sealing the acupoints of the embroidered uniform guard warriors but also that fellow over there, what's going on? At Zhu Wenhyang's words, Mok Jiangan still replied with a smiling face. There aren't many places where we can have a quiet conversation here. So, I prepared a modest setting, although it's not much. Prepared a setting? Yes, but someone tried to make an appointment first, so I had to make them yield like this. Tap. Mok Jiangan placed his hand on the head of a trainee wearing a headscarf and concealing his identity. Then, the trainee who had been kneeling trembled. Judging from the reaction, he seemed to be terrified. Who on earth is it? It was difficult to tell who it was just by looking at the attire. But he wasn't particularly curious either. If he tried to save that trainee from Mok Jiangan's hands out of a misplaced sense of sympathy, it might lead to more troublesome matters. At that moment, Mok Jiangan removed the headscarf from the trainee's head. Why Bu Chong? He was surprised inwardly at the unexpected face. Why was that fellow, who could be considered a pre-selected candidate from Prince Jianjan's faction, caught in the hands of that unsightly bastard? While he was perplexed, Mok Jiangan said with a smile, "He had done something interesting to your wooden pillow." Something interesting? Zhu Wenhyang glared at Wai Buchong with eyes filled with suspicion. He seemed to be filled with fear, unable to even make proper eye contact. He was a disciple of Gwi Saman, the sixth devil sovereign of the demonic alliance, so he had acted more arrogantly than anyone else, as if there was nothing in the world to fear. But to see such a fellow making that expression. What did he do? Zhu Wenhyang opened his mouth, puzzled. It's poison. Yes, that's right. At Mok Jiang'an's affirmative answer, Zhu Wenhyang clicked his tongue inwardly. He had known it for a long time, but perhaps because he had received teachings from the Demonic Alliance, an unorthodox sect notorious for its wickedness, he had become even bolder. To think that he would try to use poison on him in a place like this. I guess I really got on his nerves. Although the bastard kept glaring at him with murderous eyes whenever he had the chance, he had expected some troublesome incident to occur in the near future, but to think it would be today was quite a spectacle. Mok Jiang'an asked with a puzzled expression, "You don't seem greatly surprised?" "It's not something to be particularly surprised about." At Zhu Wenhyang's words, the corners of Mok Jiang'an's mouth slightly lifted. As if he had found something interesting. "I'm starting to want to have a deeper conversation with you." "I don't." When he flatly refused, Mok Jiang'an chuckled. Then, he tapped Wei Buchong's head, who was trembling in fear, with his fingers and said, "Don't be like that. Let's have a bit more conversation. Before that, what should we do with this fellow? It's a gift of sorts, so do you want to take him graciously?" Mok Jiang'an was giving him the choice. At this, Wei Buchong looked at Zhu Wenhyang pitifully and moved his eyes up and down, as if pleading for help. "Please. Please." Although he had wanted to kill Zhu Wenhyang so badly, at this moment, he was the only lifeline. This bastard was truly a fiendish fellow. Zhu Wenhyang, who had been staring intently at this sight, spoke. "I refuse. It's a bit much to simply accept as a gift someone who tried to harm me. If you're going to give it as a gift anyway, I'd appreciate it if you could cleanly deal with it yourself." "Proxy murder?" At these words, Mok Jiang'an said with a smile. He was even cunning enough to understand his intentions right away. If he was going to give it as a gift, he should handle it thoroughly himself to avoid any future complications. On the other hand, Wei Buchong's eyes widened as if they would burst out. What the hell are these bastards? He was on the verge of going crazy, caught between the two who were casually bargaining over his life as if buying and selling goods. If Mok Jiang'an hadn't sealed his mute acupoint, he would have screamed or begged for his life, but there was nothing he could do. He couldn't understand how he ended up caught between these crazy bastards. At that moment, Mok Jiang'an grabbed his head and neck with both hands. "Proxy murder. You're quite calculating despite having someone who tried to take your life right in front of you. To refuse such pleasure." He was licking his lips as he said that. Seeing Mok Jiang'an like that, Zhu Wenhyang took a deep breath. This fellow might be even more dangerous than he had thought. Zhu Wenhyang opened his mouth without showing any reaction, as if it was nothing. "It's not like I have a big backing like someone else." Behind that fellow were the Heaven and Earth Society and Imperial Concubine CO. On the other hand, from Zhu Wenhyang's perspective, directly killing Wei Buchong would lead to troublesome matters. The guy was a disciple of Gwi Saman, the sixth devil sovereign of the Demonic Alliance, and belonged to Prince Jiangjan's faction. He wasn't even an embroidered uniform guard yet, merely a trainee, so if he hastily killed the bastard, there was a high probability that Prince Jiangjan's faction would make a fuss. Even if the bastard had tried to poison him. "Backing? You're quite the exaggerator." "All right. Then, let's consider this my small gift." "What?" It was at that very moment. Mok Jiang'an grabbed Wei Buchong's hair and tilted his head back. Then, he whispered into the ear of Wei Buchong, who couldn't do anything due to the acupoint sealing. "Do you know? When this type of poison enters through the skin, its effects appear very slowly. But there's also a way to make it work quickly." Wei Buchong's pupils trembled. Even the person who had provided him with this poison needle didn't know about this, so how did this bastard know? It was a moment of bewilderment. Stab. The poison needle pierced Wei Buchong's right eyeball. Arg! Despite the mute acupoint being sealed, when the needle penetrated his eye, the pain was so severe that Wei Buchong convulsed and even let out a groan. Even Zhu Wenxiang, who had been watching this scene, was at a loss for words for a moment. He never expected him to stab the poison needle into the eyeball. Wei Buchong's movements, who had been convulsing in pain, ceased not long after. But before anyone knew it, he had a dazed expression and was in a trance. Ha! Zhu Wenxiang clicked his tongue at the sight. Truly bold. That fellow's backing wasn't ordinary either, yet there was not a shred of hesitation in his actions. Mok Jiangun smiled brightly and said, "Is it a satisfactory gift?" He was smiling with a radiant face, but it was filled with nothing but malice. Dangerous. Really. Instinct was strongly warning him, telling him not to get involved with that bastard. While his mind was somewhat complicated about what to do, Mok Jiangun took steps towards him. "Now that I've given you a gift, shall we learn more about you?" Swish. Mok Jiangun's figure blurred in front of his eyes and instantly closed the distance between them. Fast. His lightness skill was beyond imagination. Zhu Wenxiang hurriedly leaped backwards. Pot. It was the silent shadow step he had learned from his second teacher. The silent shadow step was a body movement technique of the silent killing sect, one of the 4 great assassin groups. Although it couldn't be said to be significantly superior to the current body movement technique of the Kongtong sect, it allowed for such mysterious movements. Swish. Zhu Wenxiang somersaulted in the air while leaping backwards, going over Mok Jiangun, who was trying to grab him. "Oh? Take this." Zhu Wenxiang, who had been rotating his energy in reverse before somersaulting, struck Mok Jiangun's back as soon as he landed behind him. Whoosh! The palm strike infused with rotating wind pressure aimed at Mok Jiangun's back. However, Mok Jiangun bent his waist while simultaneously rotating his body sideways, and then struck Zhu Wenxiang's head and neck with his legs in succession. Bam! Thud! Zhu Wenxiang, who was hit on both the neck and head simultaneously, crashed to the ground. It was so painful that he almost lost consciousness for a moment. Grit! Zhu Wenxiang, who gritted his teeth, launched another palm strike with reverse rotation towards Mok Jiangun's ankle as he lightly landed after striking him. Whoosh! This time, even Mok Jiangun couldn't avoid it. The moment it touched his ankle, Mok Jiangun's body was flipped over by the fiercely rotating condensed wind pressure and was sent flying. It worked. Even Mok Jiangun, who seemed to have reached the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm according to his estimation, couldn't withstand this power. But the moment of joy was short-lived. Mok Jiangun, who had been sent flying, maintained his balance with ease, let alone falling over. Tap. Interesting technique. What the? This bastard? Zhu Wenxiang was dumbfounded. It was the reverse rotating true qi that possessed the power to almost turn the jiak stone slab into powder fragments. It had struck his ankle directly, yet he was too unscathed. No. He wasn't completely unscathed. The torn flesh near his ankle was slightly open, and blood was flowing down. Mok Jiangun, who had regained his balance and stood upright, slightly frowned as he looked at the wound on his ankle. I blocked it with death qi, but a wound still formed. Death qi was the energy of death. It could scatter most ordinary true energy, but Zhu Wenxiang's technique not only didn't scatter but also penetrated his death qi and inflicted a wound. Is it because of that energy after all? The energy in Zhu Wenxiang's middle danjian was different from ordinary internal energy. It felt completely opposite to his own death qi or demonic qi. The corners of Mok Jiangun's mouth slightly lifted. I'm starting to become more and more interested in that power. With those words, he took steps towards Zhu Wenxiang again. At this, Zhu Wenxiang endured the pain and stood up. It's a labyrinth. This was a complete monster. To reach this realm at such a young age, unlike himself who had become strong due to various opportunities, he was a true genius. There was no confidence in defeating him. However, he couldn't just take it lying down. Pot. Zhu Wenxiang, who judged that he couldn't defeat Mok Jiangun with his current skills, leaped towards the main hall of the 6 offices officials of the embroidered uniform guard while simultaneously trying to shout. At that very moment, Mok Jaehyun's figure blurred and instantly reached in front of him. Crazy! He was even faster than before. Mok Jaehyun, who appeared right in front of him, struck his Adam's apple with the blade of his hand between his thumb and index finger. Ack! He couldn't shout as he was hit in the Adam's apple. As he staggered backward for a moment, Mok Jaehyun grabbed Ju Wonhyang's wrist with lightning-fast arrest techniques and twisted it behind his back. Then, he placed his left palm on the immobilized Ju Wonhyang's chest. And he injected death chi into his activated middle danjian. Whoosh! The purpose was to find out what this unique energy in Ju Wonhyang's middle danjian was. It was at that very moment. Roar! The middle danjian in the heart area became heated as if a flame had ignited. The surging hot energy began to strongly push out Mok Jaehyun's death chi. Mok Jaehyun's eyebrows raised. What is this? Mortal, why are you doing that? Chong Ryong asked, seemingly puzzled. The energy in his middle danjian is completely pushing out the death chi. It was a phenomenon he had never experienced before. The energy of death scatters and weakens the energy possessed by living beings. However, this energy in Ju Wonhyang's heart, the middle danjian, strongly responded to the death chi and pushed it away, preventing it from approaching. It's the first time I've seen innate source energy with such deep purity and strength. Source energy? Did you just say source energy? Yes. Huh. At Mok Jaehyun's words, Chong Ryong couldn't hide her astonishment. She, too, had doubts when Mok Jaehyun said that Ju Wonhyang had an exceptional energy in his middle danjian, not the lower danjian. But upon learning that it was innate source energy with deep purity that opposed the energy of death chi, she could now be certain. Mortal. It seems this fellow has learned the breathing technique of the immortals. Chapter 237. Primordial True Chi. Part 2. Mortal. It seems this brat has learned the breathing technique of the immortals. The breathing technique of the immortals? Chong Ryong spoke to the puzzled Mok Jaehyun. Do you remember when I told you that the techniques for circulating energy and cultivation methods or divine arts originated from the breathing technique of the ancient Taoists? Yes. In the distant past, Taoist priests or immortals who had achieved deep cultivation practiced a breathing method to boost their source energy for longevity and ascension. Boosting the source energy itself, not just internal energy? Isn't source energy the predetermined life itself from birth? Yes. The energy of life is originally a predetermined source energy. That's why, in the distant past, it was called Primordial True Chi. Primordial True Chi. It was the true original True Chi that humans possessed innately from birth. In this regard, things like internal energy were called postnatal True Chi, as they were cultivated postnatally. Amazing. I heard that the breathing technique of the immortals, the method of cultivating primordial True Chi, had already been lost even in Taoism a long time ago. Then this person has cultivated the primordial True Chi that had been lost? The only energy that can completely oppose the energy of the dead, death chi, is that. At Chong Ryong's words, Mok Jaehyun's eyes flickered with interest. Primordial True Chi, which was completely opposite to death chi. Perhaps this was the reason why he had felt a strange aversion since the first time he saw him. To this, Chong Ryong warned Mok Jaehyun. Be careful. Even if it's a weak energy, if it's completely opposed, it could be very fatal to you, mortal. Before the warning could even finish, the hot energy surging from Ju Wonhyang's middle danjian caused a great rebound. As a result, Mok Jaehyun's palm, which had been placed on his chest, was repelled. Seizing that fleeting moment, Ju Wonhyang struck a palm strike infused with primordial True Chi towards Mok Jaehyun's danjian. Bang! Mok Jaehyun's body bent like a shrimp as he was hit in the abdomen. It worked. It wasn't because he had been hit. The moment the palm strike touched his abdomen, it was to disperse it using the technique of harmonizing and blending. Crackle! The primordial true chi flowed out through the soles of Mok Jiangun's feet, and the stone on the ground cracked. Seeing this, Zhu Wenhiang clicked his tongue. He never expected him to disperse the palm strike so easily from this distance when he was caught off guard. However, the real strike wasn't this palm strike. With his other hand, Zhu Wenhiang unleashed the reverse-rotating true chi he had prepared and aimed at Mok Jiangun's heart. It's that technique again. Perhaps it was the technique with the greatest power among the ones Zhu Wenhiang had learned. However, it was his mistake to show the same technique multiple times. From Mok Jiangun's perspective, this was no different from kindly providing a lesson. Whoosh! At that moment, death chi began to condense and rotate in reverse in Mok Jiangun's palm as well. Sensing this, Zhu Wenhiang's eyes widened. No way? However, Mok Jiangun and Zhu Wenhiang's palm strikes collided. Bang! Simultaneously, a strong wind pressure erupted, and cracks formed on the ground around the two. The moment of collision was almost a balance of forces. At this, Zhu Wenhiang couldn't hide his inner shock. How did he do this? The reverse-rotating true chi was a very profound technique. It wasn't the type of technique that could be learned simply by observing. It required enlightenment of the true meaning contained within the technique. Yet, seeing Mok Jiangun precisely imitating it, Zhu Wenhiang was naturally astonished. Tremble, tremble. The force rotating in reverse was in a stalemate for a moment. It was even more so because the energies of the two were completely opposite. However, no matter how opposite the energies were, there was bound to be a difference in strength. I am being pushed back. Zhu Wenhiang's pupils trembled. As Mok Jiangun drew upon more death chi. Bang! Zhu Wenhiang's body was repelled backward. He flew several feet and rolled on the ground several times before coming to a stop. Ugh! Zhu Wenhiang, who had suffered internal injuries, vomited a mouthful of black blood. A monster-like fellow. He collapsed limply. This was the first time encountering such a monster. From the realm he had reached to his energy, everything was on a different level, so he wasn't an opponent that could be dealt with through any means. Cough cough. Zhu Wenhiang, who was coughing up blood, staggered and barely managed to stand up. His legs were trembling. With his current condition after suffering internal injuries, it was impossible to even escape. Zhu Wenhiang raised his head and looked at Mok Jiangun. And then he was dumbfounded. Just a scratch? He was in such a state that it was difficult to even move due to internal injuries, while Mok Jiangun only had a small scratch on his palm. At that moment, Mok Jiangun, who had been staring intently at the wound on his palm, opened his mouth. That power you possess. It seems quite troublesome. What? I'm talking about primordial true chi. At these words, Zhu Wenhiang's eyes widened. How did this person recognize primordial true chi? Primordial true chi was different from ordinary internal energy that could be cultivated postnatally, so it wasn't the type of energy that could be discerned through perception. At this, Zhu Wenhiang asked in a rather serious voice, You? What on earth are you? Who knows? That's not important, but I'm in a dilemma. A dilemma? I'm thinking it might be better to kill you now, considering the future. What? As soon as those words were spoken, he took steps towards Zhu Wenhiang. It seemed he was going to put it into action immediately. Even though he was approaching slowly, Zhu Wenhiang couldn't properly control his body due to his internal injuries. Step, step. The sound of Mok Jiangun's footsteps, approaching with murderous intent in his fingers, sounded like the signal of the underworld guard opening the gates of hell. And that signal quickened. Mok Jiangun leaped forward, intending to behead Zhu Wenhiang in an instant. Unable to avoid it, Zhu Wenhiang stared intently at Mok Jiangun, who was swinging his fingers with a desolate gaze. At that moment, smack! Mok Jiangun's fingers, which had been about to behead him, stopped precariously on his skin. Drip. However, due to the murderous intent condensed in his fingers, the skin was cut, and blood flowed out. Zhu Wenhiang asked, puzzled, Why did you stop? You're quite peculiar. What do you mean by that? You're the first person to make such an expression before getting beheaded. What do you mean by such an expression? Usually, people would either be overwhelmed with fear and lose their senses or glare at me with resentment. Of course, they would also tightly close their eyes before dying. But you stare at me intently even at the moment when your neck is about to be cut. And with a very desolate expression at that. This was a first for Mok Jiangun. He thought all humans would be the same in the face of death, but Zhu Wenxiang was different. There was not a shred of fear towards death itself, and there was no feeling of resentment towards him either. There was only a gaze of regret. At this, Mok Jiangun asked, "I'm curious about why you had such an expression." Zhu Wenxiang frowned at this question. What on earth was this bastard? He couldn't read his thoughts at all. He abruptly tried to kill him and then stopped for a strange reason. It's a meaningless question, isn't it? The power of life and death is in your hands anyway. Still, I don't know, so I'm asking. I don't know if you're playing with me, but after encountering a person like you, I absolutely don't want to make you an enemy. If I'm forced to do so, I'll have to desperately try to kill you using any means necessary. You're honest. There's no need to deceive when I might die anyway. At his words, Mok Jiangun lifted the corners of his mouth. It's a first. What's a first this time? Although that troublesome energy is annoying, I don't particularly want to kill you anymore. You don't want to kill me anymore? Yes, it seems like a very inefficient decision, but I don't dislike you that much. At Mok Jiangun's words, Zhu Wenxiang frowned and couldn't hide his bewilderment. Did this fellow really have a change of heart as he had said? Anyway, if there was a change in his mindset, it was also an opportunity to save his life. At this, Zhu Wenxiang carefully gestured towards the fingers with his eyes and said, "Then, can't you take this away?" I haven't received an answer yet. What answer? Ah. Was he asking why he had such a desolate expression when he was on the verge of death? He seemed like a really peculiar fellow. Why did he want to know such a thing? It was incomprehensible, but he wanted to end this situation, so he opened his mouth. I just regretted that moment. You regretted it? I had resolved to change everything with my own hands, but I was about to become unable to do anything again. At Zhu Wenxiang's words, Mok Jiangun looked at him with peculiar eyes. They were clearly around the same age. But the way he spoke was as if he had gained enlightenment in life. That aspect felt very peculiar to him. At this, Mok Jiangun said to him, after hearing your answer, even more, before he could even finish his words. Smack. At that moment, Zhu Wenxiang's figure in front of his eyes disappeared. Where did he go? Mok Jiangun moved his eyes and surveyed his surroundings. Then, he saw a blurry figure charging towards him with tremendous momentum from the right. The speed was so immense that it was difficult to discern with the naked eye. It was impossible to avoid. Swish. Bam 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 bam. In an instant, something swiftly brushed past him. Along with it, the vital points of his entire body were struck, and his body was sent flying limply into the air. Crash. Ugh. Mok Jiangun's expression stiffened as he fell to the ground. Not only was it painful, but due to the energy penetrating the major vital points, his body couldn't move. That energy was suppressing the death chi within Mok Jiangun's body with a fierce momentum. Through this, Mok Jiangun could tell. This was primordial true chi. It was identical to the energy Zhu Wenxiang possessed. The difference was that it was primordial true chi that was incomparably vast and profound compared to Zhu Wenxiang's. A chilling voice reached Mok Jiangun's ears. Trainee Mok Jiangun. As expected, you are a dangerous existence. The owner of that voice was none other than Commander Xiao Yeren, the deputy supervisor of the embroidered uniform guard selection process. Thanks to that, Mok Jiangun realized that his judgment had been correct. When he first saw Xiao Yeren, he had felt an aversion similar to Zhu Wenxiang, but only for a fleeting moment. However, unlike Zhu Wenxiang, she possessed internal energy, so he had received this aversion faintly, but as expected, she had also cultivated primordial true chi. Groan. Groan. The primordial true chi that had penetrated his body suppressed the death chi and tried to penetrate his 5 viscera and 6 bowels. At this, Mok Jiangan took a deep breath and transformed his energy. Roar. At that moment, black energy surged from Mok Jiangan's body. It was demonic chi, born from gathering all the energy he had obtained so far, including death chi, into one. Whoosh. The moment the energy was transformed into demonic chi, the profound primordial true chi that had penetrated each vital point was pushed out and oxidized, rising like a haze. What? At this strange sight, Commander Xiao Yaren's pupils, who had thought she had completely subdued Mok Jiangan, trembled faintly. Chapter 238. Primordial True Chi. Part 3. Whoosh. Mok Jiangan slowly stood up as a hazy smoke billowed out. Commander Xiao Yaren's pupils trembled as she looked at him. He's pushing out the primordial true chi that had penetrated his vital points. Primordial true chi was the source energy itself, so once it penetrated the body, it was difficult to expel it externally unless one possessed stronger internal power. However, the ferocious energy currently rising from Mok Jiangan was surprisingly pushing out the primordial true chi. What on earth is this energy? The smoke was gradually turning into black haze. The energy was difficult to describe, feeling both turbid and even evil. At this, wariness filled her eyes. Even after having his 8 vital points struck and adjusting his power to utilize such energy. This person. He has crossed the wall. Xiao Yaren was convinced at once that Mok Jiangan had crossed the wall. From the moment he had crumbled the Jiak stone in the first test, she had estimated that he had reached the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm or possibly even higher, which was quite astonishing. How could someone not even in his early 20s have reached such a realm? I heard he was a disciple of the Shadow Clan master of the Heaven and Earth Society. If the information she had heard in advance was correct, that was the case. However, even the Shadow Clan master of the Heaven and Earth Society hadn't reached this level of realm. Explaining this as simply the student surpassing the teacher seemed insufficient. Everything about this person, from his energy to all aspects, felt dangerous. Let's subdue him for now. Anyway, the bastard had tried to kill Ju Wenhyang. Then, there was no need to show mercy. Pot. Commander Xiao Yaren kicked off the ground and leaped towards Mok Jiangan. Her figure blurred and disappeared in an instant. At that moment, Mok Jiangan's right eye flashed. Along with it, Mok Jiangan utilized Na Yorang, the great master of the Heaven and Earth Society's bright water crossing step, and moved his body with ultra-high speed movement. Smack. The moment Mok Jiangan moved, a hand abruptly emerged where he had been standing. It was none other than Xiao Yaren's hand. He dodged it? Xiao Yaren's delicate eyebrows raised upwards. Considering that the opponent was an expert who had crossed the wall, she had increased her speed to match that level. Yet, he had avoided it. Moreover, his movement was extraordinary. Ultra-high-speed movement? Her eyes shifted to the right. There, Mok Jiangan, who had dodged her attack, was thrusting his fingers infused with black energy towards her to launch a counterattack. Strong energy? Judging from the momentum, it was definitely strong energy. But how could strong energy contain such a ferocious energy? She felt the primordial true chi within her body strongly rejecting it. It's not something to block with ordinary strong energy. At this, Huang. She concentrated her primordial true chi and created strong energy with a white light in her hand. With the strong energy formed, Xiao Yaren thrust her fingers towards Mok Jianyuan's wrist as he was stabbing towards her head. Quick response. At this, Mok Jianyuan hurriedly stopped his thrust and changed direction using his footwork. Bam! And he kicked upwards with his leg towards her chin. Smack! However, Mok Jianyuan's kick brushed through the air. She had twisted her body to the side in an instant. Not stopping there, Xiao Yaren dug closer to Mok Jiangan and swiftly placed her palm on his abdomen. Bang! At that moment, a rippling shockwave occurred from the point of impact. It was the issuing of strength. The energy infused with primordial true chi would penetrate his body and dig into his 5 viscera and 6 bowels. Or so she thought. Bam! At that moment, her palm, which had been issuing the strength, was repelled. Puzzled about what this was, she soon couldn't hide her astonishment. That was because she discovered that Mok Jiangyun had placed his palm towards her back. This fellow. He had blocked the issuing of strength with another issuing of strength. It was an unbelievable level of judgment. How could he use the issuing of strength towards her back in this fleeting moment? This wasn't something that came from long experience. It could be said that his combat sense itself was very innate. However, an opening. Thud. She had more experience than she appeared. Therefore, she didn't miss the opening that appeared in Mok Jiangyun the moment he blocked the blow with a reverse issuing of strength, and she struck a palm strike at his chin. Mok Jiangyun's body, hit by this, floated in the air with a whoosh and flew 8 feet back before falling. Having been hit on the chin, the impact to his brain prevented Mok Jiangyun from immediately standing up due to dizziness. Strong. Mok Jiangyun clicked his tongue inwardly. Among those he had encountered so far, excluding that mysterious old man and the Heaven and Earth sect leader, she was undoubtedly the highest level. Moreover, he couldn't even gauge the extent of her skills. Mortal. This wench is not using her full strength. I know. Mok Jiangyun agreed with Chong Ryong's words. Unlike himself, who was using his full power by releasing even the demonic chi he had been hiding, she wasn't drawing upon all her energy. In his right eye, which had unleashed the power of the third eye, he could see her striving to suppress her energy. If all of that were to be released, he couldn't even estimate the level it would reach. Cough cough. Commander. At that moment, Zhu Wenhyang called out to Commander Xiao Yeren. Due to being hit in the Adam's apple by Mok Jiangyun and suffering internal injuries, his voice didn't come out loudly, but there was no way an expert of her caliber wouldn't hear it. Xiao Yeren turned her head and said, Zhu Wenhyang. Your internal injuries are severe, so first focus on circulating your energy and breathing. Hurry. At her words, Zhu Wenhyang shook his head. This was to dissuade her for the moment. Regardless of the process, Mok Jiangyun had ultimately given up on harming him. Therefore, he wanted to explain the situation, but... Commander. First, stop. Before he could even finish his words, Xiao Yeren extended her hand and turned her head. That was because Mok Jiangyun had already stood up again. You're strong, Commander. As Mok Jiangyun spoke, Xiao Yeren clicked her tongue. Even though she had adjusted her strength, she thought the palm strike she had sent to his chin would eventually make him lose consciousness due to the impact on his brain. However, Mok Jiangyun looked unscathed. Judging from this, his recovery ability seemed to be much faster than ordinary people. As expected, he's a dangerous person. It was a dilemma. She had intended to stop at a moderate level of subduing him. However, it might be better to handle it properly after all. At that moment, Zhu Wenhyang hurriedly took steps towards her and tried to shout. Commander. First, listen to me. Cough. At that instant, blood burst from Zhu Wenhyang's mouth. After suffering internal injuries, he should have circulated his energy and expelled the death chi that had entered his body, but by continuously neglecting it, it had ravaged his 5 viscera and 6 bowels. Thud. Ugh. Seeing him collapse and vomit blood, Commander Xiao Yeren's eyes became fierce. Along with it, killing intent rose. Sensing this, Mok Jiangyun's eyes narrowed. The energy has risen. In his right eye, which had unleashed the power of the third eye, he could see her primordial true chi, which had become much larger than a moment ago. The energy was rippling in all directions. This woman might have reached the pinnacle of the transformation realm or possibly even higher. Swish. It was at that very moment. Commander Xiao Yeren suddenly disappeared, and with a lightning-like trajectory drawn in his right eye, she appeared beside him. At this, Mok Jiangyun hurriedly concentrated his energy and raised his left arm. Thud. Crack. The impact felt on his left arm. Along with it, Mok Jaehyun's body was pushed to the side by more than 10 steps. Mok Jaehyun, who had been pushed back like that, gritted his teeth and barely managed to avoid falling over. My left wrist is broken. This alone highlighted the stark difference in their power. It seemed to be at least twice as much. Barely enduring the trembling of his left wrist, he clenched his fist, and Seo Yerin warned Mok Jaehyun. It would be best for you to give it your all. I'll make you pay the price for putting trainee Ju Wonhyang in that state before I arrest you. With those words, Seo Yerin's figure disappeared again. She intended to subdue Mok Jaehyun not half-heartedly but decisively. Even if it meant breaking all the bones in his body. In that manner, she appeared on Mok Jaehyun's right side in an instant and unleashed a leg technique towards his right ribs. At that moment, Mok Jaehyun blocked it with his right arm. Thud. Naturally, she thought he would be repelled again this time. Whoosh. However, Mok Jaehyun's body was pushed back by only about 3 steps. Crackle. Crackle. At that moment, Seo Yerin's eyes saw Mok Jaehyun's right hand bulging with blood vessels and turning black. As if his hand was transforming into that of a ferocious demon, she frowned and muttered. You. What on earth? Phew. Aesthetically, it's not pleasing to the eye, so I didn't want to show this, but I have no choice. It was the evil acupoint demonic technique. It was a method to temporarily amplify energy through the great technique of reversing acupoints. Ordinary martial artists would rapidly consume their true original energy or go out of control when using this, but Mok Jaehyun could perfectly control it by utilizing it partially. He amplified the energy in only one hand? Commander Seo Yerin was inwardly amazed. Just how much was he hiding? Soon, Mok Jaehyun, who had amplified the energy in his right hand using the evil acupoint demonic technique, took a sword finger stance. This sword finger stance was none other than demonic sword art, first stance. It was the first stance of the sword art he had created. Demonic sword art? Why did you name it that instead of just calling it a sword art? I want to combine the cultivation method and sword art into one instead of troublesomely separating them. Combining the cultivation method and sword art into one? Yes. Mok Jaehyun, who had come up with this strange idea, had named this sword art the demonic sword art. The first stance of the demonic sword art could be considered the best technique Mok Jaehyun could currently unleash. Pot. At that moment, Mok Jaehyun leaped forward. Even though he could perfectly control the evil acupoint demonic technique, the time he could maintain it was short, so he did it to quickly decide the match. Whoosh! The moment Mok Jaehyun unleashed his sword technique, the amplified black strong energy created a massive trajectory, sweeping forward with a momentum like a raging wave, as if it would engulf everything in front of him. Faced with the tremendous momentum of the sword technique, Seo Yerin's expression became noticeably serious, unlike before. Moderation won't work. The sword technique before her eyes was a matchless sword technique. It seemed impossible to block it with an ordinary technique. At this, Seo Yerin overlapped her index and middle fingers of her right hand to form sword fingers, and then she firmly stepped on the ground and pulled them back. Roar! At that moment, her sword fingers condensed intense energy from the fingertips, as if they were the eye of a typhoon. Flinch! Mok Jaehyun's eyes sharpened. This is... It felt dangerous. He had never seen energy being raised to this extent before. However, he was already in the midst of unleashing his sword technique, so he had no choice but to clash. Crash! Seo Yerin thrust out the hand she had pulled back, as if piercing through the approaching Mok Jaehyun. At that moment, a sharp murderous intent arose, and it created a whirlwind of sword energy. Clang 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 clang. Surprisingly, the power of the two matchless techniques that collided was in a stalemate. Ju Wonhyang, who had been circulating his energy and barely managing his internal injuries after vomiting a mouthful of blood, couldn't hide his shock at this sight. He knew Mok Jaehyun was strong from having faced him, but Commander Seo Yerin, who could be considered his teacher, was a hidden expert whose strength was unknown. If she were to use her full power, he could confidently say that her martial prowess would be stronger than even the 8 stars, who were called the top experts. However, a stalemate? The sight of these two techniques clashing was truly astonishing. It was like a raging wave and a whirlwind colliding. The sword energy unleashed by the two ceaselessly intertwined, neither side giving way even slightly. Clang 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 clang. Even the person involved, Seo Yaren, was surprised. To have power on par with the true condensed spiral sword? She, too, was greatly amazed by Mok Jiangun's matchless sword technique. She had thought it was extraordinary, but she never expected it to have power comparable to her best technique, which she was most confident in. It feels like my whole body will be torn apart. On the other hand, Mok Jiangun was focusing all his senses on the sword technique. If he made a single mistake, he would be caught in this whirlwind of sword energy and have his entire body torn to shreds. He had already reached the 18th out of 24 stances. Since Seo Yaren's sword energy was also gradually losing its momentum, he just needed to endure a little longer. Or so he thought, but at that moment, "It's been a long time since I've encountered such a matchless swordsman." With those words, she stepped on the ground with her other foot and firmly stepped down. Thud. Along with it, she withdrew her right hand and pulled back her left hand's sword fingers, then thrust them forward. Whoosh 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 whoosh. Seeing this, Mok Jiangun's pupils trembled. Continuously? He never anticipated that the technique would continue in this manner, intertwined with the end of the sword technique's momentum. Moreover, this time, the sword energy rotated in reverse, continuing with a momentum quite different from before. Since the direction had changed, it became even more difficult to block it. Crackle! Crackle! Even the evil acupoint demonic technique had reached its limit. In the first place, it was a technique that rapidly amplified energy through the great technique of reversing acupoints, so maintaining it for a long time was unreasonable. Would he be defeated like this? In Mok Jiangun's eyes, the center of the massive whirlwind was visible. All the momentum was surging from there. At that moment, Mok Jiangun's eyes flashed. I need to aim at the point where the momentum originates. To do that, he needed a force that could overwhelm that momentum, even for a moment. Even if it was just for a single instant. The moment he realized this, Mok Jiangun's thoughts began to converge into one. And that converged thought reached a simple conclusion. Gather into one. He would concentrate all the stances of his strongest sword technique, the demonic sword art, into one. It was no different from gathering all the sword energy and stances contained within the sword technique into one. With Mok Jiangun's current realm, this was an almost impossible task. However, driven to the edge of a cliff, Mok Jiangun's thoughts and will cross the boundary that ordinary people could never surpass. Has he given up? On the other hand, seeing Mok Jiangun's sword energy weakening, Seo Yaren sensed that he couldn't win and thought he had given up. But it was at that very moment. Whoosh 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 whoosh. The 24 trajectories of black light that had been extending while scattering particles of dark light dispersed simultaneously and converged into a single point. And a black line was drawn through the center of the whirlwind of sword energy. Clang! Along with it, an astonishing sight unfolded. Before anyone knew it, Mok Jiangun had passed Seo Yaren and was standing behind her, grasping his sword fingers and exhaling roughly, while the whirlwind of sword energy she had created had vanished without a trace. Moreover, drip drip. Blood droplets fell to the ground, flowing along her left hand's sword fingers that had been lowered.